Okay, I'd like to introduce Asa Simon Mittman, professor of art history at Chico State, who writes about medieval monstrosity and geography. His Cartographies of Exclusion, Anti-Semitic Mapping in Medieval England is in press, and From Local to Global Maps and Map-Making During the Middle Ages and Maps and Monsters in Medieval England, second edition, are under contract. And you don't mention this in your bio, I don't know why, but you were also the editor of the research companion to the Monsters and the Monstrous, which has been hugely influential, at least to me. And I see Sam Langsdale nodding as well. Okay, give it up, please, for Dr. Mittman.
Are we doing 15 or 20 because there's three of us instead of four? Okay.
Are you saying I went long?
No,
Are you saying I went long?
You want to fight about
This is old school. This is how we used to do it in the old days.
fist fights on the floor? Okay. Hello. Thank you all. Thanks for coming. This is a long day. 5 o'clock is a long time to, it's a late slot. So thank you all for being here and awake. The Cartographies of Exclusion, Anti-Semitic Mapping in Medieval England is now no longer in press, but in print. Hey! Woo! First copy. This was 15 years of work, and so it's far and away the longest project I've ever engaged in and the hardest thing I've ever done. And so it's done, and I thought, yay, I don't have to do that anymore. I can finally think about more pleasant things, which would be like literally anything. And then I get this call from a friend who teaches at St. Joseph's University, and they have, they've just redesigned their museum, and they've put back on view an object that had always been on view there, which was a life-size plaster cast of Michelangelo's famous sculpture of Moses from the tomb of Julius II. And when it went back on view after a couple of years of being off view while they were renovating the museum, there was suddenly a public outcry about the presentation of this anti-Semitic imagery in a museum context with no contextualization thereof. So they asked me if I would give a talk about it. I'm not interested. It's Michelangelo. I really don't care. I could not care less. But because a friend asked, I agreed, and that began what I'm worried is going to be another very long project. So that's where I am. So what I'm going to present is just a little bit of the backstory, the kind of standard stuff that we think we know, which isn't always quite as clear as the sort of public line on it. And then I'm going to share with you a handful of images that present very different models for the presentation of a Moses with horns. And I'm trying to figure out what they all add up to. I'm not a fan of taxonomies. People have been using the word slippery a lot today. I prefer things murky and muddy, and I'm not a big fan of nice, clear resolutions. But nonetheless, I'm trying to see if I can at least begin to think through how these horns might operate in a variety of ways, in a variety of images. Some of them, perhaps, laudatory, I'm fairly sure. Others, perhaps, most definitely, demonizing, condemnatory. And so that is my goal. So this, of course, is the most famous example. This is the one that the modern world knows, though there are thousands of images that precede it, only for the span of about 500 years. I will show you the contenders for the two earliest surviving images. Both of them are around the year 1000. So this is not an ancient image. It is not also, and I think this matters, a Jewish image. It does not predate or exist outside of medieval Christian conceptions. And so that is how we get to here. So this one was for the much delayed, oft deferred, and grandly diminished tomb of Pope Julius II, aka the warrior Pope Giuliano della Rovere, who was elected Pope in 1503 and died in 1513 with the tomb unfinished. So how do we get to this image with the mightiest of all Jewish prophets presented with a pair of horns sprouting out of his head? Michelangelo wrote so much down. He wrote complaining poems about the backaches and neck aches he had painting the Sistine Chapel. He wrote complaints about art critics. He wrote complaints about the Pope. He wrote complaints about other artists. He literally only wrote down complaints. But as far as I am aware, he said nothing about the horns on this figure. And that has left a void where people have jumped in. Now, in case you think that this is some ancient history, I realize I am a rarity at this conference for speaking about old stuff. This is a very present and continuing fascination and concern that people had. And I just Googled a couple of things and came up with a whole lot of horrifying stuff, where some people asking, have you ever met someone who legitimately thought Jews had horns? Yes, I've met many. And people give their various accounts. And then, of course, you can find those same people going online to ask the same question. Well, is it true that they have horns? I shave mine down every morning. Hurts like hell, but what can you do to blend in? In Hungary, it's tails, so those are easier to hide, says my Hungarian Jewish friend. But the answer that we get to this one actually is quite revealing. So, is it true that Jews have horns? David Simon, Orthodox Jew who spends way too much time fighting trolls, is his little tagline there, says, pretty sure we can thank Michelangelo for this one. Yeah. When he was commissioned by Pope Julius to sculpt Moses for his tomb, he decided to use some literary license, as in Exodus, and then we get a bit of a biblical quote. Now, it seems fairly common knowledge. I like this one very much. Yes, this is a person who defines himself as a Jew says he's horned because he was born a unicorn, which is very nice. I hope he was. So many people, it's a sort of a common truism, though it is untrue, that this can all be laid at the feet of St. Jerome, who translated the most important version of the Bible, Christian Bible, that runs from the whole of the Middle Ages. He dies in the early 5th century. He reads Greek and then teaches himself Hebrew in order to translate both the Hebrew Testament and the Christian Testament anew. And people say, oh, well, he's the guy we blame because he translated this very complicated Hebrew word, which I'll explain in a moment, into a less complicated Latin word that meant horned. He actually did none of that. So it's often referred to as a mistranslation. It isn't. He did quite well. So the Hebrew term in question is this word keren, which the sort of standard reading means became radiant, or to shoot out horns or rays. And the association is that rays are, like conceived as sort of, think of a child's drawing of a sun or something. They're conceived as horns-shaped, triangular projections. And so keren means like with those projections coming out. But generally, it is used in terms of light. Moses goes up. He speaks directly face-to-face with God, the only person who does this throughout all of Jewish scripture. Abraham is allowed to look at God's backside through a cleft in a rock as he passes by. Nobody else gets to look at him at all. So the idea is that the Jewish God is so grand, so vast, so unencompassable that you can't just sit down and have a chat with him, that this would be an obliterating experience. And only Moses, the most powerful of Jewish prophets, is able to endure this without obliteration. But he comes back messed up. He comes back somehow transfigured, transformed. Something has happened to his face. What has happened to it, most inconveniently, is a hapax legomenon. Now, this is one of those wonderful terms, yes? A hapax legomenon is a word that only exists once in a language. Now, if that language is an ancient language, like Biblical Hebrew, it's very hard to ever figure out what that word meant because you can't use any of the other contexts in which it appears because there are none. So this is the only place that this word appears in its verb form as opposed to other versions, other variants of this root stem that mean things like rays and horns and so on. And so Jerome is translating this, right? And he hits this word, and he's like, I have no idea what this really means. So what does he do? He actually goes down the street and asks the local rabbis, well, what does it mean? And they explain to him, it's this very complicated thing. We don't actually know. It's a habex legomenon. I don't know if they're using that term. But they give him this whole big picture. And he goes, I can't believe this. There's a word in Latin that's exactly the same word. So he translates it into, that's the Hebrew root stem, a whole lot of translations. He translates it into a Latin word, cornuta, which means maybe, rays, horns, shining. It's got all the kind of multiplicity and duality embedded in it. Now, modern translators have attempted this in a variety of ways. Almost all of them give you something like, I know you can't read that from out there, but his face was shining, the skin of his face shone, his face was shining and he didn't know it. It was shining because he'd been speaking with the Lord. His face was ablaze with light. I like that one. Only the Douay-Rheims, which I don't know if any of you have encountered, is a very influential 16th century English translation of the Latin Bible. That's the only one that gives us his face was horned in English translations generally that I can find. It's highly unusual. Again, we're going from this Karen, and even in the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation, we again get, in this case, the sight of the color of his face became glorious, another variation on this. All of these different attempts, the Latin Vulgate, as I said, will give us cornuta esset facias, his face was something. But again, we don't really know cornuta. Well, okay. The Latin Vulgate renders it very wrongly. This is a standard interpretation you can get when you look at a commentary on the Douay-Rheims, that his face was horned. To painter, which has given occasion to painters to represent him in a ridiculous manner, as having horns coming out of his forehead. I mean, yeah, kind of is, right? There is the Latin. Ruth Mellenkopf is the only other scholar to really take this on seriously. She wrote the only real book that exists on this subject. It was published in 1970, which is why I think it's probably time for a new take. She says, Jerome did not, however, think for one moment that Moses had received real horns, but rather he meant cornuta in its time-honored metaphorical sense of strength, honor, victory, kingship, power, and salvation. Yes, we can all agree that the Hebrew Bible does not intend to mock and insult Moses. Yeah? A fairly uncontroversial claim, I believe. Okay. Wrongly translated, wrongly translated, wrongly translated. We get these over and over and over again. English may, though, actually be the problem. Okay, so Hebrew's got this complicated word. Great. Latin's got this complicated word. Great. Greek even has a complicated word. Great. English didn't. So this is the earliest English translation of the Bible. It was produced around the year 1000. It's in a thing called the Hexateuch, which is the first 6 books of the Bible, translated into Old English, which is the variety of English that, say, Beowulf is written in, not generally readable or recognizable to speakers of present-day English. But there we read of Moses, that he was yeherned, that he was horned. Doesn't mean anything else. It doesn't mean radiant, it doesn't mean shining, it doesn't mean honored, it doesn't mean glorious. It just means his face was horned. Why do this? What did they mean by that? Well, this manuscript that has this text is actually illustrated. It's the most heavily illustrated book from the entire period. It has 400 illustrations in it. The next highest number is like 100. So it is unique, absolutely a standout in this. And what you see here, you see Moses. He's actually leading his followers in a dance here. He's got his brazen rod that will become the serpent, but he's just using that to direct dancers around him. And you may note, he is not, in fact, horned. Yes? Yes, okay. There we can see Moses right beneath him. That's how we know he is Moses, among other things. Well, then he goes up the mountaintop, and you can see him up there, most notably meeting with Jesus. You can tell because of the cross named Taylor. This is a Christian manuscript, not a Jewish one, despite it being telling Jewish stories here. And so we see Moses communing directly with, in this case, God, but who is depicted as Jesus. He is humble, moderate. They seem to be having a lovely conversation. Jesus holds a book. Moses holds a scroll, indicating a sort of transference from old style to new style, which is how this transition is often represented. Then, so he turns and he goes back down. He's very angry. The people are worshiping a golden calf. He really shouldn't be angry. He's just gotten the commandments. He hasn't shared them with them yet. They don't yet know that you're not supposed to do that. It's on the texts. So he goes back down, and as soon as he gets to the bottom of the hill, horns. Yes? Now, he has to carry a veil in front of him, on and off for the rest of his narrative in the story, because he is somehow alarming to his people. Whatever has happened to his face is worrisome, it's troublesome to his followers. So he carries this veil in front of himself sometimes. But the thing about this set of rather grandiose and beautiful horns that he has is that they are attached to a headband. We can see him here again. He's leading the fight against Og of Bashan, who is a giant. Have you not seen his bedstead, which is of iron? It is 9 cubits long, etc. And if we look here, we can see that's the beheaded Og of Bashan. And there is Moses, and there is the very clear band that is holding the horns on. Yes? We can see him here again, where he is depicted as the manum robustum, the mighty hand of God. You can see the hand of God coming down, speaking directly to him, where he raises his hand. And then, in his death scene, we can see him again at the top of this very complicated image, talking with God, and at the bottom talking with the people, and again in this more fully painted image, again very clearly wearing a headdress. Okay, Moses dies. The demons in this manuscript are unhorned. Satan is unhorned. The mouth of hell unhorned. So I'm going to skip over this, which is another, you can see there, another horned Moses. This is the other one that might be as early. It's not nearly as interesting. But after this moment, the horned Moses appears everywhere. It becomes omnipresent in Christian art of the Middle Ages. Now, it does not become omnipresent in Jewish art of the Middle Ages, just Christian, but we see it over and over and over again. So what are we to make of it? Well, I've been trying to break these down into categories. So first off, we have ones like the Hexateuch that I just showed you, where he gets them specifically on Mount Sinai. So there he is, he goes up, he's not horned, he comes down, he's horned. Yes? So that is a marker of a thing that occurred to him through contact with God. All right, that suggests one thing, maybe honor. 2, sometimes they're gold. That's usually a good thing, right? Usually, except maybe when he's right next to the golden calf. The goldness may lose its shine. Okay, probably honorific. Golden, great, golden. Silver! I mean, it's almost as good as gold, right? Okay, maybe. He looks really grumpy and depressed here for some reason, but also silver. Okay, fine, great. What about when they're just hair? I like this. I don't know what products he had available to himself. But pretty glorious. Okay, now, you got a little dicier. So what about when they seem to be actual cow horns? What about when they directly mirror the horns on the golden calf, which is an idol, which medieval Christians had these very fancy ideas about idols. They did not think they were simply foolishness or idiocy. They thought they worked. That's why they were so dangerous. But they thought they were all inhabited by demons, which, because they were fallen angels, actually knew all sorts of things and so could provide real answers to questions brought to them. So, if the calf is an idol and the idol is efficacious, then the idol is a demon, and if the demon has horns and Moses has horns that match the demon's horns, maybe not honorific. Okay, what about when he has a halo but they're red? I'd have no idea. Even if he's sort of chatting with Jesus, sort of equally, but he's got red horns? What about when his horns are black and very cow-like, which makes him kind of animalistic, and they have happened before he has climbed the mountain? This is him taking off his shoes, talking to the burning bush. Again, it's Jesus in the burning bush here, but no matter. He's about to climb that mountain. What about when he has them as a baby? What if he's born with them? which suggests not a transformation wrought through contact with the divine, but a question of his own biology, an intrinsic property that he has, something that might be passed down for 1,000 years of generation up until the present, where people keep asking, do Jews have horns? I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Asa. I was asked that as a child. I also shaved mine down.
It hurts, right? It hurts.
It hurts like hell. It's no fun. Yeah, like hell. Exactly. It's no fun. It's true. Our next speaker, I'm welcoming back to the Festival of Monsters, Michael Kobre, Dana Professor of English at Queen's University of Charlotte. His writing has appeared in Michigan Quarterly Review, Inks, the Journal of Comic Studies Society, South Atlantic Review, Tin House, Tri-Quarterly, and essay collections on Bruce Springsteen, Walker Percy, and superhero bodies. And he's the author of Walker Percy's Voices. Please, big hand for Michael Kobre.
Okay, that's a tough act to follow. So let's go from Moses and the Bible to the X-Men.
Equally canonical.
In their own ways, yes, indeed. Less difference than one might think. I'm going to sort of work my way into this argument in a slightly different way, so just bear with me for a few moments. The man with the shaved head in the long black coat looks nothing like his former self when he walks into the police station. There's no purple cape like the one he wore during his first comic book appearance in 1963. No red tights and purple trunks, no purple gloves or boots. But his power at least is familiar, even if he doesn't now conjure magnetic fields around him or manipulate tanks and missiles like toys. Although in 1963, those missiles he hijacked always seemed to land in unmanned areas. Here, let's see if I can work this. Yes. Here, in a sequence of 6 horizontal widescreen panels across 2 pages, we follow him as he walks through the police station and notes every metal object: badges, staplers, guns, keys, bullets, which are identified in small insert panels that are distributed across both pages and set inside the larger panels in a bravura display of comics form that lets us see him as he moves and simultaneously see through his eyes. Turn the page, though, and it's all carnage, as the man in the long black coat activates his magnetic powers and sends a storm of metal shrapnel flying through the station. Then, in a triptych of insert panels on the 4th page of the sequence, he assembles stray pieces of metal into the familiar iconic shape of his helmet, modeled after a 15th century Italian barbuda with its Y-shaped opening for his eyes and mouth. As he lifts off the ground in a single panel across the rest of the page, with his coat flying open to reveal a new military-style black costume trimmed with white, a bystander shielding his face below the man in black cries out, "It's Magneto." But the protagonist of this 2014-2015 solo series, written by Cullen Bunn and drawn by Gabriel Hernandez Walta and others, is not exactly the same character as the one created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee in 1963, or redefined by Chris Claremont in the 1980s. Introduced in X-Men #1, Magneto was at first a fairly standard arch-villain, intent on demonstrating his power and conquering the world. Although in Magneto's case, this conquest was in the name of the genetic heritage he shared with the X-Men as mutants. As the next step in evolution, mutants should rule the world, Magneto believed. The human race no longer deserves dominion over planet Earth, he proclaims in X-Men #1, sounding not all that different from a host of other aspiring alien tyrants in other comic books. Magneto, at first, was distinguished most of all by Kirby's visual design of that iconic helmet, which was red in 1963 with devil's horns on top, interesting horns connection here, and a purple lining around the opening for his face. Kirby used Magneto's helmet to keep his face in shadows and accentuate his eyes, always glaring madly out from the darkness around them, an effect that made even a one-dimensional character like Magneto a little more fearsome. It was only in the X-Men's second run, revived as a title in 1975 after a brief cancellation and long years as a second-tier Marvel series in the 1960s, that Magneto's character would be explored. Written by Chris Claremont from 1975 to 1991, with an expanded cast that would feature new, wildly popular characters like Wolverine and Storm, this version of the X-Men gradually revealed that Magneto was a Holocaust survivor, driven by the anguish of a past that he saw repeating itself in the persecution of mutants by robot sentinels, big giant robots who were always going after mutants, and by religious fanatics. "Mutants will not go meekly into the gas chambers," he declared in issue 161. "We will fight." Claremont, an architect of long-form storylines that could continue to unfold for years, envisioned an ongoing subplot in which Magneto would evolve from, quote, the X-Men's quintessential adversary to the inheritor of Xavier's vision, end quote. Embracing at last the assimilationist vision of Professor X, the X-Men's mentor, in which mutants would coexist peacefully alongside humans. For Claremont, looking back at his work in a 2015 interview, Magneto's transformation would become, quote, the ongoing seminal story of the whole run, end quote. But that storyline was aborted in 1991 when Marvel's editorial policy demanded that Magneto return to his old status as the X-Men's foe, and Claremont, indignant at this choice, quit the title. Like the narrative lives of all characters enmeshed in the complex continuities and vast interconnected universes of contemporary superhero comics, Magneto's portrayal by different creative teams over many decades would vary dramatically. In a 1993 storyline, which fully embraced his renewed status as a villain, he would sabotage electrical systems all over the world and rip the unbreakable metal adamantium that covered Wolverine's claws and bones out of his body. In 1999, as a militant nationalist, Magneto would seize the island nation of Genosha and rule over it as a sovereign mutant country, though Genosha would later be destroyed by Sentinels, them again, in Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely's New X-Men in 2003, with its population of 16 million mutants slaughtered, in a Holocaust analogy of sorts. In 2009, returning again as an ally, Magneto would join a faction of X-Men who'd established a mutant refuge in San Francisco Bay on the remains of his own former headquarters, Asteroid M. By 2014, and the beginning of Bunn and Walter's series, Magneto was still allied with the X-Men after their disastrous conflict with the Avengers. A lot of summary here. In a 2012 crossover series in which the two teams had battled over the cosmic Phoenix Force, which inhabited the bodies of several X-Men and then short-circuited all the mutants' powers after the Avengers' victory. You guys got all that? Appearing simultaneously with Brian Michael Bendis' run on X-Men, which featured Magneto as an occasional member of the team, Bunn and Walter's series saw the one-time arch-villain struggling to deal with his own reduced power as he traveled the world to avenge atrocities inflicted on mutants. As Bunn explained in a 2015 interview, he envisioned the series in his initial pitch to Marvel as, quote, a horror story with Magneto. Emphasizing how terrifying Magneto's powers would be to ordinary people caught in their wake, Bunn said that he wanted, quote, wanted to play with the idea of Magneto as a monster in terms of the way other people see him. So in the opening pages of the first issue, a terrified bystander describes Magneto's murder of a doctor who supported anti-mutant organizations, first ripping the fillings out of the man's teeth and then impaling him with a metal traffic sign driven through his throat, which we see in flashback in an oversized panel that takes up half the second page. As a consequence of his reduced powers, Magneto's violence in this series is more intimate, turning mundane metal objects into instruments of destruction and torture that rend flesh and tear bodies apart, like a simple paperclip that he inserts under the skin of a scientist working on a new breed of sentinels while he interrogates her until he drives the paperclip up through her veins and into the base of her brain to kill her. Killing is like second nature to him, that witness in the first pages of issue number 1 says. Another bystander, a survivor of Magneto's attack on the police station, says in the second issue that he's, quote, like a tornado, only if the tornado enjoyed what it was doing. In his own internal monologue running throughout the series, too, Magneto continually wonders who he is among all the different names and identities he's assumed in his life. quote, Eric's, Max, Magnus, Magneto, terrorist, savior, hero, villain, he thinks, as he walks through the police station in the first issue. But he ultimately concludes on the last page of the second issue, in a judgment he'll echo in the final issue as well, that the bad times and hopelessness he's experienced have turned him into a monster. Indeed, from the image drawn by Paulo Rivera on the cover of the first issue, which shows Magneto's face and shaved head, framed by an outline of his helmet hovering around him that's shaped out of barbed wire, and that's the image on my title slide, the series insists on a connection between the monstrous violence he inflicts on his victims and his status as a Holocaust survivor. Even his shaved head in this series, so different from the leonine mane of white hair given him by Jim Lee and other X-Men artists, reminds us of the shaved heads of prisoners in concentration camps. Within the series, too, beginning with a flashback in the second issue of the series that shows young Max Eisenhart, that's Magneto's original name, trying to smuggle stolen food into the Warsaw Ghetto, the series continually evokes his past as a survivor in flashbacks, in Holocaust imagery, like the barracks and barbed wire of a mutant detention camp in the ruins of Genosha in number 9, and in a running subplot in which he's haunted by the memory of a particularly murderous Nazi officer, Hitzig, whom we meet for the first time in that flashback sequence in number 2. Colored by Jordi Belair in shades of evening blue that highlight the rain and darkness of Warsaw's empty streets, and framed by Walter's borderless panels, which visually suggest that these memories can't be contained, the sequence shows Max and his two companions attempting to slip back inside the ghetto with stolen food through a hole in the base of the wall, before the last of them, Max's friend Avner, is caught by a pair of German soldiers and then interrogated by Hitzig. Pressed to name his accomplices, Avner names only the third member of the group, a boy named Levi, sparing Max before Hitzig, after promising mercy for cooperation, executes Avner anyway. For Magneto, in the present, brooding over his memories as he investigates a homeless encampment whose members are being experimented on with Sentinel technology, the sacrifice of Levi, quote, like a lamb before God, end quote, is evidence of his own destiny. I have to believe that this was done, he thinks, because I am meant to determine the course of history. But by the end of the issue, after Magneto attacks a group of operatives, a press gang, he calls them, descending on the encampment to kidnap more test subjects, killing most of them with a handful of rusty nails driven into their skulls and their eyes, Magneto actually imitates Hitzig, promising mercy for information to the last survivor of the press gang, whom he holds at gunpoint with a pistol hovering in the air above the man's head. Magneto, like Hitzig to Avner, breaks his word and shoots the man anyway. Bad times teach you lessons, and they eat you alive, he thinks, in the issue's final captions, just as hopelessness can crush your spirit and turn you into a monster, end quote. But the fact that Magneto, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, echoes the actions of the oppressor who haunts him, the Nazi officer Hitzig, complicates this narrative of righteous vengeance and forces us to think more deeply about the particular nature of Magneto's monstrosity and its tangled roots in Jewish history. In his book Tough Jews, Paul Brines analyzes the long and deep ambivalence in Jewish culture about strength and power. For European Jews who were often forbidden to own land, to farm, to hunt, denied admission, in Brines' words, to the worlds of material production and violence, end quote, a tradition of gentleness emerged instead, both by choice and by necessity, what Daniel Boyer in his book Unheroic Conduct identifies as edelkeit, a Yiddish word that means nobility as well as gentleness and delicacy. But while the culture of edelkeit idolized its Torah scholars and what Boyerin calls the scholars' secularized younger brother, the Mensch, an alternate tradition that celebrated and yearned for strength and power existed too in Jewish culture. This tradition was manifest in isolated historical episodes like Simon Bar Kokhba's failed revolt in Judea, now part of the occupied territories, against the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE. And as Brines points out, it was manifest in Jewish fantasies too, like Sigmund Freud's childhood fantasies about the Carthaginian general Hannibal, or, to go beyond Brines, for that matter, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's creation of Superman in the 1930s. As Siegel and Schuster, a pair of mensches from Cleveland, Ohio, told Look magazine in 1941, they had, quote, dreamed of what they would do if they were the world's strongest men, end quote. Ultimately, this yearning for strength took political form in the modern world with the rise of the Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century and its more radical and militant faction in the early 20th century, the revisionist Zionism of Zev Jabotinsky, which engaged in armed rebellion against the British mandate in Palestine and envisioned a Jewish state from the river to the sea. That Magneto, like all superpowered characters in American comic books, is a descendant of Siegel and Schuster's Superman is obvious, of course. It's practically inscribed in the fabric of Magneto's cape. But the character we meet in Bunn and Walter's series, this monstrous figure of rage and vengeance, also fits easily in that tradition of fantasies about Jewish strength and violence, though neither Bunn nor Walter are Jewish. In Tough Jews, Bryans explains that his own interest in this tradition was inspired by reading a spy novel, Triple, by Ken Follett, also not Jewish, about a Holocaust survivor turned Mossad assassin for whom, in Bryans' words, quote, the still visible blue numbers on his arm are his license to kill, end quote. In much the same way, the numbers tattooed on Magneto's or Max Eisenhardt's arm function as his license to kill, too. More importantly, Magneto's characterization, as it was first developed by Chris Claremont in the 1980s, was shaped by a historical figure from the revisionist Zionist movement who is a direct disciple of Zev Jabotinsky. This is Menachem Begin, the Israeli prime minister from 1977 to 1983. As a young man, Begin had been a leader of the underground paramilitary Irgun. He masterminded acts of terrorism and was hunted by the British in Palestine. Later, he was one of the founders of the Likud Party, which has dominated Israeli politics for decades and presided over a massive campaign of settlements and occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. And of course, it is a Likud prime minister today, Benjamin Netanyahu. And of course, for Begin as prime minister, he signed a historic peace treaty with Egypt and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize alongside his Egyptian counterpart, Anwar Sadat. For Chris Claremont, this seeming narrative arc of Begin's life, from terrorist to peacemaker, would be the model for Magneto's gradual transformation into the inheritor of Professor X's dream of peaceful coexistence between mutants and humans. It would show, Claremont said, as with Menachem Begin, you can start your life as a terrorist and turn into the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, end quote. But the darker presentation of Magneto in Bunn and Walter's series hints at a more nuanced view of Begin's legacy, and by extension, that tradition of Jewish militarism from which he emerged. Because that kind of militarism, which we see now in the Scorched Earth campaign in Gaza and in the continuing transformation of Israel from a democratic state to an occupying power, relies, like Magneto, on the evocation of the Holocaust as a justification for its actions. In Tough Jews, Paul Bryans points out the importance of the Holocaust, a term which in fact was only coined in the late 1950s as an increasingly crucial part of Jewish identity, which would then be imposed as a kind of narrative frame on the Israeli-Arab conflict, particularly after the Six-Day War in 1967. This is Bryans now. The vulnerability of Jews destroyed by Nazism was easily transferred to Israel's vulnerability on the eve of the Six-Day War. The Nazis were easily replaced by Arabs, end quote. As a result, Bryans argues, quote, the Holocaust, precisely because of its imagery of Jewish victimization, enabled Jewish Americans and Israelis to embrace the consequences of the Israeli victory, occupying the West Bank and Gaza, turning the Palestinians there into subject people, end quote. And that's Bryans writing in the 1970s, by the way. In a terrible irony of history, then, the descendants of oppressed Jews become oppressors themselves. Like Magneto imitating Hitzig, the survivor becomes a kind of monster too. In Bunn and Walter's series, the memories of the Holocaust that shaped Magneto become literally toxic in the final issues, when another mutant with the power to bring dreams and memories to life unleashes a psychic projection of Hitzig. These are comic books, after all. That can only be stopped if Magneto takes his own life or kills the girl who unleashed his memories. That he chooses to kill her, one of the mutants he's sworn to protect, suggests, in the exaggerated symbolism of superhero comics, that an identity and mission forged only by the rage and pain of a tragic past is inadequate to create a just future. In the series' last arc, which ties into the company-wide crossover Secret Wars, in which parallel worlds collide and the entire Marvel Universe will be rebooted. Sorry, missed that. And the entire Marvel Universe will be rebooted. Magneto himself realizes that the scars of his past have corrupted him and undermined his best intentions. I let my own fury drown out the voices of the people I swore to defend, he thinks, as he sacrifices his life trying to stop one of those parallel worlds from colliding with Earth. As he had concluded only a few pages earlier, while flying off to battle, I have always been and will always be the monster. Thank you.
Wow, great. Thank you so much, panel. A lot to talk about here. A lot of stuff. Where do we begin? Who would like to speak? Who would like to ask a question of the panel? I have so many, but I don't want to dominate.
They're just stunned into silence.
They're stunned into silence. That Magneto stuff was good. Okay,
It's been a long
yeah.
day.
Don, go ahead.
For one, thank you to all of you. These were wonderful. This question is specifically for Michael. And it's just as someone who has been very heavily influenced by X-Men and sort of the queer narrative and that sort of allegory. I was wondering, and beautiful breakdown of Magneto and sort of the ethics of that. I was wondering if you've seen the new TV show, the new cartoon, X-Men 97.
Yes.
And how you took their portrayal of Magneto and your thoughts on that, how they sort of melded Claremont's as well as Grant Morrison's vision and sort of what that says.
I think it's pretty faithful to Claremont's vision. I've seen it, and my memory is okay. I think it's pretty faithful to Claremont's vision, and I think it presents him, for the most part, although I believe if I'm recalling the final episodes, it changes, that it presents him for the most part as a heroic figure. There are major portions of my argument that I left out in the surface of time. But I think one of the problems with this, the portrayal of Magneto in this way, and I think Bunn and Walter's series is a fascinating but flawed series in many ways. But I think one of the problems in this, and this is a problem sort of inherent in the use of the memory in this way, is that it defines Jewish identity solely in terms of the Holocaust. Throughout the representation of Magneto as a character, and Marvel was very cagey, very uneasy, I should say, with the identification of him as Jewish. The only time he's finally identified, definitively identified as Jewish, is in the first X-Men movie. And it's after that that Marvel commits to that role. But it's the identification of him as Jewish only through his experience of the Holocaust, leaving out all other dimensions of Jewish values and Jewish culture and Jewish identity. One text that I wanted to weave in here, I'll just mention it by association, is a book by Dara Horn called People Love Dead Jews, which really deals with the limitation of seeing Jewish culture in this way. So I think there are all kinds of I'll put this mildly, unfortunate consequences to this sort of prism of looking at Jewish identity.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, John.
Well, yeah, just to follow up that question, given everything that you just talked about, and also in relation to the cartoon series, how do you feel about the whole sort of online meme-like Magneto was right movement, which seems to have become sort of a popular sort of shorthand for he was right about how prejudice works. He was right about how we treat marginalized people. He was, so there's this sort of valorization again of Magneto as this figure of empowerment and of resistance and of, but given this history that you've just laid out, what do we make of that?
Yeah, that slogan gets introduced by Grant Morrison during his run, and it's meant ironically. Morrison ends his run with a version of Magneto who's just a crazy madman terrorist, really engaged in mass murder. And that portrayal is so dark that Marvel says, no, it's not really him, in a retcon later, and I don't know the details of how they changed it. It wasn't really him in that. I guess I think this is a way of sort of embracing him as a figure like so many comic book characters, like the Batman is redefined by Frank Miller in The Dark Knight Returns, like Wolverine, like the Punisher, with that really attractive notion of the hero as the violent avenger in those ways. And I think it's perhaps an accurate representation of Magneto's character as it's been defined. But again, it leaves us with a really limited character and a really limited view of Jewish identity in that way.
Thanks. Who else? Who would like to? Yes, great.
Thank you so much. I have two, as a fellow non-modernist in the room, I have two really rather technical questions for Professor Mittman that may end up needing to simply be addressed outside in terms of things that people who are modernists really don't care about. But I was really curious about the Greek word that's used to render the idea of the, as a Latinist, I'll use cornutus. I'm not going to butcher the Hebrew, but the cornuta. I was curious about the Greek word and what its valences were. And I was also curious about what the sources are for the illustrated manuscript that produced the Gehirnt. What do we think that English translation is derived from, and like how exactly did that little mistranslation slip in? Thanks.
Okay, so I will leave the Greek to the Greek experts. My one semester of undergraduate ancient Greek. It's an astonishing language. There are 80 forms to every verb. I highly recommend it, but it's crushing. It was fascinating, though. But in regard to the Old English Illustrated Hexateuch, that's what that thing is called, London British Library, Cotton Tiberius B4, if you'd like to look it up on your own. So it has a preface to it that explains where it comes from, sort of. And that is from Aelfric of Eynsham, who is a very prominent abbot and theologian in early medieval England. And he's writing it to this guy, Alderman Ethelward, who is a very unusual guy because he is a layman and literate, which is almost unheard of in the period, and he seems to even read Latin. And so Aelfric writes to him and he says, "You keep asking me to translate Genesis, and I don't want to do it." Now, his reasons for not wanting to do it are very interesting, because what he says is, you don't want the common people to be able to read this stuff. He's quite overt. He says, if they read it themselves, they'll think they can make their own interpretations, and that's our job. And he says, the real danger is that they will read what he calls the Old Law, the Old Law, and that they will read the Old Law and think that they may live now just as the patriarchs lived then. And then he goes on, he clearly invents some guy. He says, I knew some mass priest who was so ignorant that he thought because the patriarchs had multiple wives, he too could have multiple wives. And so if you give the ignorant populace access to Hebrew scripture, they will simply become Jews. So this is his big fear. And so, but apparently, Alderman Ethelward is unrelenting, and Aelfric says, okay, fine. I'll give you a little bit of Genesis. And so he translates a little bit of Genesis, and there's all kinds of interesting stuff that happens in the transformation. He's translating it from Jerome's Vulgate, which is the dominant Latin version. That's what every, sort of Western European monastery would have had as their standard text. And then somebody else, unknown, finishes out the first 6 books. It's not quite a translation. It's often called a paraphrase because it leaves out like whole chunks of it, very interesting chunks, not accidental chunks, I think. And so it's a kind of condensed, shortened, Englished Cliff Notes version of it that then has all of these illustrations there to help control the readings. So that, for example, the creation cycle, instead of showing Yahweh creating everything, shows a triune God having 3 forms: old man with white beard, young man with brown beard, pale, ghosty-looking guy all in pink, doing the creation. So it inscribes Christianity at the very origins of the universe. Christ is the one who's seen as creating the world, and so on. And so it's a way of, I mean, in a sense, kind of colonizing the Jewish text with Christian meaning from the outset through both of the control of language and the control of images. And then, a century later, the manuscript gets an extensive Latin commentary that does a whole lot more of that again. So they're very nervous about this book.
Fantastic. Yes, Kathy.
This is a question about horns. You know, if I look at it, oh, you know, it's the moon, the horns on the moon, the cattle, the golden calf, or things like that. But I wonder, is it only Moses in the Middle East that gets this particular imagery, or is it related to that whole phenomena of divine earth, cattle, fertility, that you see all of the place going east?
So there was a sort of kind of a Joseph Campbell era in art history, where there was a lot of kind of world archetype stuff. I tend to not be very convinced by those, but there have been arguments that have been made that, yeah, there are all of these horned deities. Mellenkopf, the other scholar, has written a book about this subject. She goes through this whole very interesting, if to me utterly unpersuasive, argument about bishops' mitres. So y'all know what bishops' hats look like. They're the big things like that. Well, if you look at them from the side, they actually have like a front panel and a back panel, but bishops used to wear them this way. They only turned them sometime in the later Middle Ages. And so bishops at some point had horns. I'm unconvinced. And I also don't think that bishops in early medieval England, I've never seen an image from the period that showed a bishop like that either. So are they connected? There are some Egyptian deities that have similarly horns like that, including some fertility or productivity of land kind of deities, Hathor. And it is, in fact, possible, this is unprovable to my knowledge, but it is possible that Moses, they're in captivity under Pharaoh. Pharaoh may have been Akhenaten, the monotheist who took over, ruled Egypt for a short amount of time. His monotheism of switching everything to a single solar god, Aten, did not outlive him. He died and then gets replaced with child King Tut, who is controlled by a group of priests who basically restore the old religion. But Jewish monotheism may derive, in fact, from Akhenaten's Egyptian version of monotheism, which maybe is kind of henotheism, not quite monotheism, but so was Judaism at the start. So it's conceivable that other qualities, other properties, other motifs traveled with these ideas from Egypt. This is possible. But we don't get any of these images. None survive prior to about the year 1000, which is when that English manuscript, and the one I very briefly showed with the one red horn, which is a German manuscript of within a decade of it, and the two don't seem to have anything to do with each other. So right then, around the year 1000, we get two images, and then they ramp up from there very dramatically. So I don't know why, if there is an ancient origin that comes from, say, one of the many polytheisms, including the ancient Near Eastern polytheism, that Judaism was originally, Yahweh is the storm god of a polytheistic system, right? So given if those origins were tied to it, why nothing for, 2,500 years? Right? Why does it not happen until 1000? I don't know. I don't have an answer. So I don't think that they do come from that. But that's my rationale for why I don't think so, but it is absolutely possible, and it is an open question.
I mean, there's lots of gypsies, there's wars going on in there, and all of this, and clowns and other things migrate over with these people who have been dispossessed within that area of the 13th, 14th century. And you see god figures in clowning in Southeast Asia, or places that turn into devils in Europe because of some of that imagery, that period.
Thank you. Yeah, Spencer.
Andrew, I'm interested. Thank you for that talk. It was a really, like, I've never seen case law presented so beautifully.
You know what? I'm sorry, everybody. I left out the radio station that sued the FCC. This is significant. A radio station played George Carlin's 7 Words You Can't Say on television at 2 o'clock in the afternoon one Tuesday, and they got sanctioned.
He didn't say you can't say it on the radio.
No, but at the time it wasn't called 7 Words on television. It was just called Dirty Words. But so there were some lovely choice quotes from that case law too, from about 1966.
Yeah, and some of what you were talking about was the earlier case law around William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, which had similar imagery of rape and violence against children in the novel. But I'm interested in your thoughts on what the significance of the media is. Like, what the fact that this conversation from that you're recounting was taking place in a play. I mean, it sounds like a Black Mirror episode or something, but the significance of it being something that would be seen live on stage. What do you think about that setting contributes to the sort of monstrosity of what's taking place?
It's what's interesting, I would say, about to answer that, for those of you that know drama, and I'm in a theater department, is that oftentimes things unseen but reported, like the ancient Greeks, for example, the violence off stage, oftentimes has more of a heavy impact. And so it's the detective who recounts what she did in terms of having sex with and then murdering with an axe. And they pop up alive again, just over and over and over again. I had my first reading, I had to put the book down, and I've assigned it in a class, and the students also self-report that, they have to take a breather with this one, which they don't with Ruined, Lynn Nottage, for example, which has really graphic imagery that is staged, but this one doesn't do it. But I think, too, that I do think that, and maybe, Michael, you would know, I think Jennifer Haley, she infers in interviews that she was aware of these cases that were going down. And in her own mind tried to think of what was the most horrific thing that most of us would willingly get upset about, and it's that violence against the innocent child, and that somehow that would be legally permissible. She wants to get this issue of legislation on our radar in anticipation of the day that it will come.
I just want to add to that it's my understanding that she's now in production of a TV series based on this play. Yeah, The Nether. So that should be pretty cool. Scary, dark, goes to some weird places for sure. I've never had the guts to give it to a class. I do give her other play that I really love, Neighborhood 3: Requisition of Doom, which is the best zombie play ever written in my view. But I don't know. I haven't spoken to her for a little while, so keep your eyes open for the Nether TV series. Netflix, I think. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts, comments, questions? Yeah, Henry.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for really great papers and presentations. I, too, was asked about horns as a kid, and so there's an interest. I mean, that's a whole nother interesting conversation, and this was not my initial comment, but, I mean, if you, you're starting a conversation that takes us back quite some time, but clearly when you go like this, when you say it took off, a really interesting question is, why does that find a ready audience? Why does it take off? Which I think is probably less about the artwork than it is more about the people receiving or viewing the artwork. Something like, and it's a harder question to unpack if you're dealing with older.
It took me a book the last time, but
yeah.
I have a very long answer to that question. But yes.
I was going to ask a question, though, to Michael, and it actually perhaps is related to my first comment, and that is, when you talk about these authors outside of the initial creators of Magneto, you don't have Jewish authors writing his story. And I wonder if that's some of the problem that these non-Jewish authors have reduced to Jewishness, to the Holocaust, and are not in touch with or familiar with and don't know how to access the broader sweep of Jewish culture and history, and if you consider that sort of a problem in a way that we don't acknowledge when it comes to sort of people writing about Jews, but we would for other groups, and say, well, you have to have, or it's a good idea to have queer people writing queer stories and so on and so forth. So I wonder if you might comment on that.
So Chris Claremont is in fact Jewish and was inspired to give Magneto this backstory based on his own experience as a young man living in Israel for a short period of time, a few months, I believe, being on a kibbutz and seeing the film Judgment in Nuremberg while he was on the kibbutz himself. So it is coming from Claremont also. I'd speculate that part of the problem here is the whole sort of fraught relationship of the comic book industry with Jewish identity. The comic book industry was in a very significant measure created by Jews who simply couldn't find jobs in advertising or comic strips or other forms of commercial art. It was a junk medium populated by outsiders, by marginal figures. And of course, that whole first generation of creators were absolutely fervent about hiding their Jewish identities. They might have, as in the case of the artist Jack Kirby, who, as I mentioned in conversation here, was actually asked when he was a soldier in World War II where his horns were. His real name was Jacob Kurtzberg. But Kirby, for instance, drew a famous picture of the Thing from the Fantastic Four in a yarmulke and a tallis. He drew that for a Hanukkah card, but he only put that privately on the wall of his studio. It was not something to be shared publicly. So I think some of the reasons for the limited representation of Magneto and other Jewish characters, and there's only a handful, really comes from that whole sort of fraught history of disguising Jewish identity in the comics. There's only a generation or so later with an artist like Howard Chaykin where that stuff becomes much more explicit. That's the best I got.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear all these stories about being asked about horns, because I was asked about horns when I was a kid, but I grew up in Salt Lake City, and so I thought maybe in that particular environment there was just that sort of belief was coming through. I had no idea it was such a common experience.
So I first started working on this book project about 15 years ago, and the first talk I gave had an image with a horned Moses. It wasn't really about that. It was about the worship of the golden calf happening just nearby. It's part of a large map that has a lot of anti-Semitic content on it that was made in medieval England at a time in answer to that question when all that stuff was ramping up very dramatically for a variety of reasons, just after all the Jews had been expelled from England. But so after that talk, a very, very prominent medievalist came up to me. I was at Oxford then, and this was a guy, an Englishman, and he came up and he said, well, I was asked by my freshman year roommate at Cambridge if he could rub my head to feel them. And I was like, wait, what? And so then I asked around, and my aunt was asked once to show her horns, and then this weird thing happened. So I've given like dozens of talks on this general material. There hasn't, you all have confirmed this yet again, I haven't given it a single time without people coming up at the end and saying, oh yeah, me too. So the sort of coda at the end of this book, so Ruth Melankoff's book is called The Horned Moses in Medieval Art and Thought. And so the end of that book is called The Horned Medievalist in Medieval Art and Thought, and engages with sort of these issues and the kind of ongoing prevalence of these medieval ideas. And I should note, of course, horns is far from the only medieval anti-Semitic narrative that has modern-day currency. So do the blood libel tales of the abduction and murder and consumption of the blood of Christian children, and so on. So these were all of these basically seem to have all been invented in medieval England. They did, in fact, move over to Germany quickly and took root there very well, but they're basically all crystallized in the very unusual circumstances of Jews in medieval England, which is to say, unlike the rest of Europe, England had no Jewish population until the Norman Conquest, none. And Jews came immediately with William the Conqueror, And within a generation, the richest men in London, Winchester, Worcester, York, and Norwich were all Jews. They were richer than the crown. They were loaning money to the English church, to the English crown. And then less than 200 years later, due to royal policies, they had been completely bankrupted and then expelled. And so it is an extremely tumultuous history in England that doesn't parallel the history of Jews elsewhere in very neat ways. And it sets up very particular engagements with Jews in the Jewish community. It's also the most well-documented community of Jews from the Middle Ages because the crown set up a special body called the Jewish Exchequer. It was an organizational body of the government whose existence only was to track financial arrangements with Jews. Consequently, what we have about medieval Jews is largely financial, which overplays the role of Jews in banking and so on, because they didn't take special effort to note like the butchers and bakers and candlestick makers who were also Jews. So we have a lot of information about this context as well. But yeah, I think the unusual circumstances there have a lot to do with the rise of these motifs there and their prevalence there and the spread outward from there to what are, actually still global phenomena that have an alarming amount of currency today.
And on that note, I'm afraid we have come to the end of our session. Thank you so much for coming. Big hand for the panel.